It is an element that is quite often overlooked when it comes down to create a really strong photograph, although it has a big impact to the composition and the story of an image. We are talking about the power of focal length. And this is what this video is all about. I'm going to tell you how I decide for a focal length out in the field. I'm going to show you the difference in handling for different focal lengths, especially between wider lenses and longer ones. And I will also show you why it is so important for me to stay flexible with focal lengths. Hi my friends, very nice to see you. I'm super excited today because I got a new lens and it is a very special one, and I think that it will help me to get out more strong photographs in future. I will tell you more about this lens later and also how I will use it for landscape photography. First of all, I got a question from Hyper, and Hyper wants to know how I decide for the right focal length when I'm building up a composition. So let's talk about focal lengths and how we decide for the right one out in the field. And I have to say, this is a really good question because the focal length has a really big impact to the composition and the story you want to tell. Basically, there exist different ways of how you can build up a composition. What is quite often to see is, and what is a quite interesting phenomenon by the way, is that when anyone buys a new lens, let's say an extreme ultra-wide-angle lens for instance, so over the next time nearly each photograph he takes is just made with this amazing wide-angular view, just for the sake of the new lens or for the sake of the new focal length what wasn't in the bag before. And don't get me wrong here, I don't want to judge. We all do this sometimes, me too by the way. And I have to say there is generally nothing bad with that. Sometimes it is even a good idea to choose for a particular focal length and try to get out the best possible photograph. It is a good training, finding and building up a composition. It could boost your creativity and it could even end up that you get out a photograph you had never thought about that it is possible. This is why I would even recommend to limit yourself to a special focal length or a focal range from time to time. But on my experience, if you would always do it like that, so that you choose the focal length or the focal range first, you are maybe not using your full potential when it comes down, and this is important now, to put the highest priority to the characters of your composition and the story you want to tell. And this is how I tend to build up my compositions. For me it is all about the story and the characters of the story. And therefore, the focal length is a really important element. It can make the difference between an average shot and a masterpiece. Finally, this is why I never choose the focal length first in such a case. First, I always build up the rough composition, I choose the characters and then the rough perspective. And when I'm clear about that, I choose the right focal length according to my story. I will tell you more details about that in a minute. Let's talk first about the impact of focal lengths to the viewers. I think this should make some things clearer. Well, which focal length I choose depends on the characters and the story I want to tell. To understand which impact the focal length has to the viewers will finally help us to decide for the right focal length. So let's compare the properties of shorter focal length with those of longer focal lengths. So with shorter focal lengths, I mean wide-angle lenses below 50mm on full frame, and with longer focal lengths, I mean tele lenses longer than 50mm on full frame. Well, shorter focal lengths have a wider angle of view, obviously, they have a higher distortion, and wide-angle lenses seem to pull the depth apart, especially when you go close to a foreground with an ultra-wide-angle lens. Tele lenses have a shallower angle of view, they have a lower distortion, and long lenses seem to compress the depth. they seem to compress. They don't really do that. It is all about the perspective that leads into that optical illusion of compression. And the important thing to understand here now is I can use all these properties of the different focal lengths to support my story. So the focal length is a really important tool therefore. First of all, the angle of view allows me to include or exclude elements to or from a frame. Perspective is very important here on the one hand, but also the focal length, because when I increase the focal length, I do nothing else than cropping in. Yeah, it is nothing more than an analog cropping tool if you want. So, and now before you comment below that, yeah, I could also crop afterwards with Lightroom. That's true, but in the one hand you would lose megapixels, and on the other hand, it were much more difficult to fine-tune your composition. And this is often the difference between an average shot and a masterpiece. However, zooming in helps me to avoid elements I don't want to have in my composition. But due to the distortion and the illusion of compressing depth or pulling depth apart, I also consider depth in my composition for the focal length. With a wide-angle lens, for instance, closer elements look bigger, distance elements look smaller. And this is something important to be considered, because if you have, let's say, a dominant mountain in the distance and you want to emphasize this dominance, what could add to your story, obviously, it might be not the best idea to use a too short focal length, like an ultra-wide-angle lens, for instance. Because with a short focal length, your giant will be transformed more to a gnome, and all the dominance will get lost, what would finally lead into a totally different story. If you want to emphasize the dominance of a giant, you have to use a longer focal length, but then you will definitely lose depth. So you see, it is a good idea to find a compromise here. Or what I always do is, if I want depth and dominance, I go for a bit longer focal length, and I just consider all the other ways of how to get depth into your photograph. And there exists quite a lot of ways, to be honest, and I made already a video about how to get depth into your photographs. I will link it up there for you. So finally we can say, first of all, I build up the rough composition in that way, and I decide for all the characters of my story, and after I'm clear about the characters, I decide for the rough perspective to emphasize the story, and finally I decide for the rough focal length. Characters, perspective, focal length. And in most cases after that, I change the perspective and the focal lengths again slightly, depending on each other to fine-tune my composition, considering everything about composition. And for the case that you shouldn't know what you should consider for composition, yeah, let me recommend you to watch all of my videos. I talk about composition all of the time. Yeah, I mean, it's the most important thing in photography. However, this fine-tuning process, changing perspective and focal length, could take a while till I got it as perfect as possible. But this is finally the reason why I want to stay flexible on focal length. And this is why I prefer zoom lenses over prime lenses, by the way. Using prime lenses could also be interesting for training issues or to boost my creativity with being chained to a particular focal length. But when it comes down to get out the best possible from a story, I prefer zoom lenses. Well, we talked already about the properties of wider and longer focal length, and due to the different properties, we get automatically a different handling for the different focal lengths or for the different lenses. The shorter I go with my focal length, the higher is the impact if I change the perspective slightly. So when I'm, let's say, 40 centimeters to a foreground, what is quite often the case when I'm working with an ultra-wide-angle lens, it is a big difference if I move my camera position 2 centimeters more to the left or to the right. This could change everything for my composition. But if my elements are all far away, as it is often the case when I'm using a telelens, it is nearly no difference if I move my camera just a few centimeters around. It is more about walking 10 meters to the left or to the right or something like that to fine-tune my perspective. This might sound now that we have to walk more when we are using a long lens instead of a shorter one, but this is just for the fine-tuning process. When it comes down to find different compositions, different stories from the same camera position, a telelens offers us much more possibilities than a wide-angle lens. And the reason therefore is simply that a wide-angle lens composition includes much more of the landscape than a telelens composition. With an ultra-wide-angle lens, we will always get the mountains in the distance into our frame unless we don't turn around totally and shoot into the other direction. With using a long lens, I can pick out details from the landscape. I can find multiple compositions which tell totally different stories, also with totally different characters from one and the same camera position. And this is also the reason why I bought this lens here, by the way. Well, what lens did I buy? It is a 200 to 600 millimeters G lens from Sony. Yeah, I know, that's quite long. Leave me a comment below what is the longest focal length you have ever used in landscape photography. I'm interested about. Leave me a comment below. And to be honest, you know, I'm a landscape photographer, but this lens, 200 to 600 millimeters, is thought for wildlife photography. But I'm anyway going to use it for landscape photography. Now, you might think that a focal length like 600 millimeters you just need if you have to compensate for something. And yeah, I really have to compensate for something, but not what you might think. So what are my plans for this lens? Well, if you're watching my videos on a regular basis, you know that I had an accident 4 or even 5 months ago. To be honest, I stopped already counting. By the way, on this point I have to say I got so many healing wishes from you over the last month. It is amazing. Comments, messages, emails. I got so many tips from you, what I could try to do when you had an injury, what helped you, and I really appreciate this, so thank you so much, my friends. So what has this to do with my new lens? Well, I'm quite happy with the photographs I got over that time with my knee injury, although I did totally hard with getting to outstanding places in the poor nature. And the thing is, after I tried to do the first hikes already, I got a big throwback 2 weeks ago, and yeah, it felt worse or as bad as it felt in the first weeks after my accidents. So I'm currently not able to walk without these here, and yeah, I mean, I'm happy that I'm able to walk. And to be honest, meanwhile, it is already really driving me crazy. It will heal for sure, but it will take a little bit longer. And yeah, I can't wait anymore. I want to photograph, and I'm able to photograph. I'm just not able to walk in the moment. So I thought, if I'm not able to hike up to the mountains, what about bringing the mountains down to me? And this is where this lens comes into the game. Yeah, it is totally unusual, even abnormal, to use this focal range, this focal length for landscape photography. And I would even never have the idea to use it for landscape photography, to be honest. But then there happened something. I was watching this video, I will link up here for you, from Adrian. He's a wildlife and landscape photographer from Australia. And he made this review about the Tamron 150 to 600 millimeters lens. And I just thought, yeah, he's a wildlife photographer, why not? If I were a wildlife photographer, I would also work with such a long focal length. And yeah, but as a landscape photographer, it doesn't make any sense to buy a wildlife photography lens. And this was the keyword for me, wildlife photography lens. Think about that, wildlife photography lens. But does anything like a wildlife photography lens exist actually? Do I use landscape photography lenses? Yeah, I mean, I use lenses with focal range that are usually used for landscape photography, what offer me advantages for the normal, usual kind of landscape photography. 200 to 600 millimeters is a focal range that is usually used for wildlife photography or maybe sports photography. But who the hell is telling us that the lens is a wildlife photography lens or a landscape photography lens or anything like that? So I thought about my options, and bringing the mountains down to me with this lens here finally was the best option for me. So my plan with this amazing long lens is to drive anywhere with my camper van and to photograph maybe just a few meters from my van or something like this with a quite long lens. With 70 to 200 millimeters on 1.4 extender, I come up to 380 millimeters, and I got out this photograph here, for instance. I think it was taken at around 300 millimeters, something like this, and I'm quite happy with it. But when you have a look here, for instance, it's also possible to pick out a detail like that. So yeah, that's really cool. I mean, with a longer focal length, you have definitely more options than with just 70 to 200 millimeters lens, what is also, yeah, already a really cool thing. So an even longer focal length will allow me to get more intimate shots in the one hand, and in the other hand I will also be able to overcome scenes in a further distance. So if there is not too much haze in there, obviously this is important. But I think the biggest advantage, especially for my knee situation, is that the long focal length, like this here, allows me to get out even more different compositions from one and the same camera position. It's definitely not the same as hiking at a mountain and taking photographs with an ultra wide angle lens, of course. I will get out totally different photographs. And I also think that the focal length will be too long in many cases, but therefore I can still use my 70 to 200 millimeters lens. What is this here, by the way, just to give you a comparison of the size of the scale. So it's a really long focal length. However, you know, I really love hiking around Indonesia, especially in the mountains, but it is not possible for me in the moment. So I could either stay at home and dream about landscape photography, or I change my photography temporarily to my circumstances. So yeah, this is what I want to compensate with this lens here. I want to compensate the ability to walk. And yeah, my friends, I'm really lucky that I had this idea, and many thanks to Adrian, by the way. But for the case that you know landscape photography veterans who gave already up because they can't walk anymore or too much or something like this because of an injury, an illness, a pain or whatever, please, please, please share this video with them. I'm sure they will be grateful therefore, because yeah, when I think about if I had already given up and someone would tell me an option like this, I think it would feel, or I would feel like a boy at Christmas Eve or something like that. My friends, I hope this video was useful for you. I hope you liked it. If yes, please give me a thumb up. It would really help me to grow this channel. Thank you so much for watching. See you next Saturday. Bye. Whoa.
I'm the landscape you need to see. You are the artist I'll never be. Stay with me and I have no doubt you'll make a painting that makes you proud.